Hello, welcome back to Chapter 9. So originally we took 2 videos to take a look at freedom of speech. Now we're going to continue on looking at other laws related to teaching and learning. So let's move forward. We're going to still start and stick with the Constitution and then move into some other laws. So let's move into the 10th Amendment. If you're not familiar with the 10th Amendment, you can see it down below. It's about the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by its states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So if you're thinking, what does that exactly mean? Basically, it means since education is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, it must be reserved for the states. It must be a state responsibility. So this is looking at the idea of who controls, who's responsible for education for schools. It should be the states. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes there is a little bit of friction when the federal government tries to come in and make swooping changes, which does occur from time to time. But generally, it should be a state's decision, which is why there can be different laws and regulations across the country because each state is a little bit different. Our 14th Amendment. So this is looking at the fact that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States or deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process. Due process is really the little part here that really connects to schools. The idea that legal proceedings should be fair, processes should be fair, regulations, laws, rules should be fair. So we have this in schools. We have rules, we have regulations, we have processes, so we need to provide our students with due process. So this can be related to the need for principals to treat students fairly, to follow the school's procedures when they're applying punishments, when they're regulating rules. You can see this in a variety of ways. So we mentioned this in our previous videos about freedom of speech. So when it comes to school walkouts, the idea that yes, you might be punished if you engage in a school walkout, but you can't be punished more harshly just because the principal disagrees with your message or is upset with you. There has to be fair and equal treatment. In fact, the ACLU has a whole section on their website giving students information about due process that is owed to them when it comes to suspensions. The 14th Amendment has also been related to, as I just alluded, student suspension cases. And student suspensions is kind of a sticky topic for a lot of reasons. There are a lot of psychologists who say, well, if the point of schools is education, should you really be suspending schools? Because then you're depriving them of an education. And I thought I would add this little meme just because, well, it's kind of funny and a little lighthearted on a serious topic. Also with suspensions, there's controversy regarding why students get suspended. So this little meme over here is looking at zero tolerance. A lot of schools that have zero tolerance policies can suspend you even if you're not really the one at fault. So even if you're just hitting someone out of self-defense because perhaps they hit you first, but no one saw that. Or if you have a toy gun in school and there's a zero tolerance policy on guns. And then again, there's a lot of different reasons why students can get suspended, and sometimes it becomes a sticky issue as to whether or not it's an appropriate reason to suspend the student. So students have a right to an education. So due process says it is required for a expulsion or a suspension of greater than 10 days. So meaning if you're going to kick a student out for more than 10 days, they are required due process because you're supposed to be providing them an education. One of the first things you have to give them is a written notice of what their charges are, when their hearing is going to be, and what kinds of evidence or witnesses you might have. Now, here is one of the important Supreme Court cases, and I like to show these landmark cases when I can. This was from an Ohio school. So out of Columbus, Ohio, 9 students were suspended from high schools, from junior high schools. And the idea was that perhaps they did not follow due process and give them notice of a hearing. So the students brought it to the courts. It actually ended up at the Supreme Court, and they stood on the student side saying, you know what, you had to give them fair notice. You had to give them a hearing if you're going to suspend them in that way. What else is needed? The students do have a right to legal counsel, especially if there's going to be some sort of a hearing regarding their expulsion. The students have the right to present their own evidence. There should be some sort of a recording of the proceedings, whether it's video or written. The student can appeal if they don't like the decision that was made. Here's a short video showing kind of the process of suspension, because this is one that can sometimes not only vary from state to state, but I found that even schools themselves have different ideas of why they suspend or types of suspensions.
Most students around East have heard of the word expelled. This means the action to take someone out of an organization.
He has two different ways of being expelled from school. One is a discretionary expulsion, where that's up to the administrator to determine if a student should be expelled. Another way to be expelled is a mandatory suspension or expulsion.
Being expelled would be, in my opinion, is you've probably done something relatively bad against school rules.
For students to be expelled, the process has many steps and thought put into it.
Well, there's a due process. We hear the evidence, and as far as an expulsion goes, the student and the school come together, and there's an officer.
So my role in the room is to listen to both sides, not just administration and not just the student. I take all of the facts and I weigh them. I look at the student's records in totality.
There are many ways you can be expelled that you may not know of.
Major forms of bullying, maybe putting something out on the internet that shouldn't be there.
Some, for example, that you might not even think about is if in your backpack you happen to have a steak knife that you went hunting with or something like that. If the blade is over 3 inches, it is mandatory that it goes to a disciplinary hearing.
There's so much that students need to be aware of. One is with the cyberbullying and trash talking that takes place on the social media, and it could be Snapchat, Instagram, Vine, I mean, you name it, whether it's a video, if it's actions or words or texts.
There's never a wrong time to speak up.
There's no wrong time to speak up. If anything, that's what's been really helpful in different situations here at East.
This has been Kara and Sydney reporting for Trojan TV.
So again, that's just a nice little summary looking at different ways that suspensions are handled. All right, so keeping in line with looking at constitutional amendments that relate to schools, we have the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment has a statement in it saying that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. What about search and seizure in schools? Because as you might be aware, this does happen. So there is the idea of permissible search and seizure. Now, the Fourth Amendment does protect you against unlawful search and seizure, but schools can have a permissible way of doing this. So if they are targeting a specific problem, a drug problem, a violence problem, if they have evidence or reason to believe that there's a problem with a particular student or a group of students, they are allowed to do searches and to seize evidence. Now, here's again another one of these landmark Supreme Court cases. In this one, we have a high school student. Her purse was being searched because they suspected cigarettes. And what they actually found was marijuana. And they ended up giving her 1 year probation, which is a very stiff sentence. She took it to the courts saying that the search went against her Fourth Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court, as you can see below, upheld the school's decision. And I find this interesting. They said that school officials can search a student without a warrant or probable cause because students have a reduced expectation of privacy when at school. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And I like that this particular site I pulled this from down below talked about how does this affect you? And the idea that, again, you might have slightly reduced rights at schools because you are under a different set of rules and procedures there, and you're expected to uphold a certain code. Continuing with this idea of search and seizure, non-intrusive searches like metal detectors, which are sometimes used at schools now, are considered to be legal. Strip searches not. I also watched an interesting video looking at pat-downs. There was a school where a student was found with a gun. And before they would let anyone leave the school, they lined up every single student and did a very aggressive pat-down of over 100 students. Whether or not they were suspected of carrying a weapon, everybody got one. And there was a lot of talk about, well, was that permissible or not? You know, that aggressive kind of a pat down. Here's a short video looking at search and seizure.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to continue our discussion of the Bill of Rights and talk about something that may actually be useful to you. We're going to talk about when the police are allowed to search your house, your car, and even you. I should probably add that there's one group of people who don't have the same protections against searches. Students. Students often think that it's not okay for school officials to search their lockers or their book bags, but those students are wrong. Most students go to public schools, where the officials are mostly government workers and are subject to the Bill of Rights. The courts have ruled that students don't have the same protections as other citizens, and that the interests of the state in keeping a safe, drug, and weapon-free educational environment trumps their privacy interests. Although there are limits to how intrusive these searches can be. Drug tests for student athletes? Fine. Strip searches? Not okay. In BT dubs, in the same way that a breathalyzer test is a search, so is a drug test, or as they say in England, a drugs test, which is probably a more accurate way to say it because they usually test more than one drug. These can seem pretty intrusive, but the courts usually rule that they are okay, especially where public safety is concerned. The state interest in drug-free schools is a pretty strong one, but the cases on student drug tests are really interesting, especially when they get into the issue of whether schools can test all students without probable cause, or only specific groups like athletes. If you're really interested, you should look these cases up. But why are you so interested? Maybe you should take a drug test. Or a drugs test. So I'm going to stop here before I get too deep in the weeds about search and seizures and the Fourth Amendment. There are two important things to remember. The first is that, like all the constitutional protections of civil liberties, it only applies to government agents. You have no Fourth Amendment protection against your parents searching your room, unless your parents are police officers, and they're on duty, and it's like official police business. The second thing to remember is that the protections in the Fourth Amendment are far from absolute. The amendment itself includes a reasonableness standard, and what is reasonable, as well as when warrants are necessary, has been and continues to be determined by the courts. In this case, as with most civil liberties cases, the courts attempt to balance an individual's interest in maintaining her privacy against the state's interest in preventing crime and keeping citizens safe. It's not an easy balance, but that's what makes the issue complex and interesting, at least to us here at Crash Course, because we're complex and interesting, right?
And I agree, it is a complex and interesting issue. All of these are. So let's take a look at some other federal laws that relate to teaching and learning. Let's see. First up, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this was covered in one of our previous videos where we looked at the history of education, but it would be impossible to go over laws related to teaching and learning and not discuss the Civil Rights Act or affirmative action. So the idea that no person in the United States should, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded or denied benefits, participation, or be under any sort of discrimination. So again, we saw how this in our previous chapters related to the end of segregation in schools. And as I also alluded to, affirmative action, which is meant to overcome past discrimination. And it can also involve a district's efforts to try to racially balance schools. So both of these are very important within the world of education and why many districts and schools have diversity officers. Another federal law related to schools and teaching is Title IX. So Title IX is looking at discrimination and prohibiting discrimination specifically related to gender. So our previous two were looking at race and ethnicity and cultural background. Title IX is gender. So here's one of the federal courts cases that I think we should all know a little bit about. So in this case, you have a transgender teenager who wanted to use the boys' restroom at his school, and the school would not allow it. They also would not change the transcript regarding the student's gender. So the student took it through the court system. The court favored on the side of the student, saying that yes, the student had rights and that the school violated those constitutional rights in indicating which bathroom the student had to use, as well as not changing the transcripts. Here's a short video talking a little bit about this particular issue when it comes to restrooms.
Gigi is a transgender student born biologically a girl, but has identified for a while as a boy, and wanted to use the bathroom that boys use. The school board initially let him do so, but then after complaints from parents reversed that decision and said that he has to use an individual bathroom stall. And so eventually he sued the school board on that decision. The federal district court initially ruled for the school board, and the Fourth Circuit reversed on the basis of the guidance that the education department had submitted. Trump administration withdrew the guidance on transgender bathroom access that the Obama administration had put in. So at this point, it's left to the local school boards until and unless the courts decide otherwise. This case is all about who interprets the statute, who gets to make the decision ultimately about which bathrooms get used and which sorts of facilities can be segregated by sex. Is it Congress in its statute? What if Congress hadn't contemplated it and the statute doesn't provide for it? Can an agency make up its mind in the first instance? What role do courts play? The Supreme Court vacated the lower court opinion and sent it back to the Fourth Circuit to decide the outstanding Title IX issue. That is, under Title IX, where does gender identity fit? Is it part of sex, or does it not fit at all? Title IX was enacted in the early 70s to ensure that women had the same educational opportunities as men. It prohibits different treatment of men and women in all sorts of educational programming. Now, there's an exception for certain kinds of facilities: locker rooms, bathrooms, showers, and sports teams. And the question, therefore, in this case is how transgender students fit in. This is the first time that the issue of gender identity in the context of Title IX sex discrimination or segregated bathrooms has come up in federal litigation, at least seriously up to the appellate level. And it could well be that we'll see this case up again at the Supreme Court after the Fourth Circuit rules. And of course, Congress can step in at any time to specify what Title IX means in this area. And at that point, we could see a constitutional challenge. Does the Constitution allow whatever result Congress comes up with? Gigi's best argument is that sex includes gender identity. That is, it doesn't matter what DNA says at a molecular level. At the end of the day, XY or XX chromosomes are less important than social understandings. If you present as a certain gender, if you feel that you're a certain gender, then there's really no reason to prevent you from using the facilities that are assigned to that gender. Gloucester County would say that Title IX is silent. Congress did not instruct anybody on how to treat gender identity, and so until it does, it's left to the decision makers on the ground, the school board and the principals, to set policy that makes sense for their communities.
As you can see, this is one of those very sticky issues where there isn't a lot of very specific guidance. And as we saw last week, that's how laws are written. They're written general, they're written abstract to be interpreted. And this also shows you a lot of conflicts between states and the federal government. We also talked in a previous chapter about how education can change based upon stakeholders and their views, based upon politicians and their views. So from one president to the next, regulations can change. So I think this is one of those cases that really shows you how sticky some of these issues can be and how complex. When it comes to Title IX, It is considered to protect the rights of LGBTQ plus students. Despite the fact that that video says that it does not, it is considered to be under that umbrella. So for instance, student couples of the same gender should have the same rules applied as other students. For instance, here's an example of a parent who is upset because her daughter was humiliated. So the two girls were a couple. They were holding hands in school like other couples are allowed to do at that school. And they say their daughter was humiliated by inappropriate comments by the teachers. The two girls were upset. They skipped class and hid in the bathroom. Now, actually, that's the big mistake that they made, because by skipping class, they did truly break a rule. And then they were found in there eating cookies and watching TikTok videos. So, again, the big reason that they ended up getting in trouble for that was because they skipped out on class. But students should be allowed to hold hands in school if that is under the school rules. Now, what a lot of schools have done since then is they said, okay, no holding hands in schools for anybody. Well, you can do that as long as it's a fair rule and it applies to all couples. Here's another one from Louisiana, where they were reinforcing that prom is for everyone, that, you know, any couple can go to prom together and any individual could be voted for prom king or prom queen. So Title IX should cover holding hands in the hallway, going to prom, what you wear to prom, as long as it fits under the school rules and as long as everyone is treated equally. So as long as all couples, all individuals are treated equally, you can't single out someone because of them being transgender or LGBTQ+. Okay, so this will be where we stop for this part of the video. When we pick back up, we'll be looking at things like the Every Student Succeeds Act and looking at other student and teacher issues. So thank you.